Number 10. Keelhauling. Some punishments became terrifying because they were slow, while others became terrifying because they turned the environment itself into part of the sentence. Keelhauling belongs to that second category of maritime horror. Associated especially with naval discipline, it survives in historical memory as one of the most brutal images of punishment at sea, a condemned person dragged beneath the hull of a ship, scraping against the fouled, jagged underside before being pulled through the water and up again, if they survived at all. That is what gives the method such enduring force. It was not simply execution. It was drowning, mutilation, and public degradation fused into one act, performed in a setting where there was no escape and no audience relief beyond open water, crew discipline, and terror. What makes keelhauling so haunting is that it weaponized the ship itself. A vessel is supposed to represent structure, command, movement, and survival against the sea. But under this punishment, the ship became the instrument of agony. That reversal matters. Some execution methods rely on blades, rope, or fire, but keelhauling turned the machinery of human order into the tool of bodily ruin. The condemned was not merely punished by sailors or officers. He was forced through the underside of the very world he served or defied. In that sense, the punishment feels symbolically complete in a way many others do not. The ship swallowed the body and the sea helped finish the lesson. Its reputation also survives because of the sensory violence attached to it. Even without excessive detail, the imagination understands enough. Dark water, panic, the inability to breathe, the impact of the hull, the helplessness of being dragged, the crew watching from above, all of it creates the kind of total vulnerability history does not easily forget. This was punishment designed not just to hurt, but to make discipline unforgettable to everyone aboard. Naval life already depended on obedience under extreme conditions, and methods like this reveal how easily military order can convert itself into theatre of terror when command decides fear is the most efficient law. What keeps keelhauling haunting is that it represents one of the clearest ways punishment can become environmental. It did not need a scaffold in the town square or a courtroom full of witnesses. The ocean, the ship, and the body were enough. History remembers it because it condensed maritime authority into one unforgettable image. Power, pulling a human being beneath the surface, through wood, filth, and water, and bringing him back, not as a restored person, but as proof of what disobedience could cost. Number 9, the rack. Some punishments terrified history through blood and spectacle, but others did something colder and, in its own way, more disturbing. They made pain look methodical. The rack belongs to that darker category of torture. It survives not because it was elaborate in appearance, but because it reduced agony to mechanism. A body was bound, stretched, and placed under escalating force until suffering became incremental, controlled, and deliberate. That is what gives the rack such enduring power. It was not simply an explosion of violence. It was violence measured, administered, and intensified step by step, as though pain itself had been turned into a procedure. What makes the rack so haunting is its simplicity. Many infamous torture devices are remembered through bizarre design or theatrical form, but the rack remains powerful because its logic is brutally direct. It takes the human body, fixes it in place, and then asks how far power can pull before the body begins to fail. There is something uniquely unsettling about this kind of punishment because it feels almost abstract in its cruelty. The body becomes a problem to be worked on, a structure to be tested against obedience, confession, or the will of authority. That is often when torture becomes most frightening, when it no longer looks emotional and begins to look administrative. The rack also survives in memory because it stands at the intersection of punishment and interrogation. It was not always only about killing or sentencing. Often it was about forcing speech, forcing compliance, forcing the victim to surrender truth, falsehood, or whatever words those in power had decided must be extracted. That context matters because it reveals one of the darkest things about torture in history. Pain was often used not as a final act, but as an argument. The body was made to speak under pressure, and the device became the language through which the state, the court, or the inquisitor announced that silence no longer belonged to the victim. What keeps the rack haunting is that it represents torture in one of its purest institutional forms. No flames are necessary, no crowd is required, no mythic design is needed. Only wood, rope, mechanism, and authority. History remembers it because it showed how easily cruelty can become systematic when power wants not merely to punish a body, but to stretch a human being into submission. That is why the rack endures as one of the great symbols of historical terror. It made suffering orderly, and order applied to suffering is one of the most frightening things history ever learned to build. Number 8. Crucifixion. Some punishments became terrifying because they were mechanically inventive, but others became terrifying because they were so stark, so public, and so prolonged that they turned the condemned body into a landscape of warning. Crucifixion belongs to that older and more enduring category of terror. It survives in historical memory not only because of its association with empire and religion, but because it was one of the clearest examples of punishment designed to humiliate, exhaust, expose, and kill in full view of others. That is what gives it such enduring force. Crucifixion was not merely execution. It was a slow declaration that power could suspend a person between life and death and make that suspension visible to everyone. What makes crucifixion so haunting is the union of exposure and duration. Many execution methods kill quickly or hide the body once the sentence is complete. Crucifixion did the opposite. It left the condemned in the open, fixed in place, stripped of movement, and subjected to time itself as part of the torment. That matters because history often becomes darkest when punishment is no longer about the instant of death but about extending helplessness until the victim's body becomes part of the public environment. Roads, city edges, and imperial spaces could all be turned into theatres of warning. The victim was no longer only a person. He became a sign. Its terror also came from its symbolism. Crucifixion was not reserved for everyone equally. In many contexts, it carried the message that the condemned had fallen beneath civic dignity and beyond ordinary mercy. That is part of why the method remained so powerful. It fused pain with degradation. To be crucified was not only to suffer physically, but to be displayed as someone whom authority wished to reduce completely. In this way, the method reveals one of the darkest truths about historical punishment. The state often wanted not simply to end life, but to redefine the meaning of that life before death arrived. The body was made into an argument about order. What keeps crucifixion haunting is that it represents punishment at its most public and most symbolic. It turned death into an event that continued long enough to enter memory before it ended. History remembers it because it was not satisfied with silence, speed, or privacy. It made agony visible, made time part of the sentence, and transformed the condemned into a living monument to fear. That is why crucifixion remains one of the most terrifying punishments ever devised. It did not merely kill, it taught entire populations what power looked like when it wanted obedience written onto flesh. Number 7. The boats. Some punishments became terrifying because they killed efficiently, but others became terrifying because they seemed designed to trap the victim inside a process so degrading, so prolonged and so methodical that death became almost secondary to the spectacle of bodily collapse. The boats belongs to that darker category of historical horror. Often connected to the same tradition as Scaphism, the method survives in memory as a punishment in which the victim was enclosed, immobilized, and exposed in a way that invited slow torment from the surrounding environment. That is what gives it such force. It was not simply a sentence of pain, it was a sentence of helpless duration, where the body was abandoned to a carefully arranged ordeal rather than struck down outright. What makes the boat so haunting is the structure of confinement. Punishments often terrify through open violence, but this one terrifies through enclosure and exposure at the same time. The condemned is restricted, reduced to passivity, and left within a system that seems less like execution and more like engineered decomposition. That combination creates a uniquely disturbing impression because it turns the victim into someone unable to resist not only human cruelty, but the slow collaboration of heat, filth, insects, and time. History rarely forgets punishments that appear to recruit nature itself into the sentence, and this method survives precisely because it suggests that power was willing to build a cage and then let the world finish the work. Its legend also persists because it occupies the border between recorded cruelty and the almost unbelievable. Some punishments become notorious because the facts are undeniable. Others become notorious because they seem too grotesque not to have been sharpened by retelling. The boats carries that ambiguity, and that ambiguity actually strengthens its hold on the imagination. Even if later accounts magnified its details, the underlying logic remains terrifyingly clear. Authorities sought a punishment that would strip the victim of dignity, movement, and control, then prolong the result until suffering became inseparable from decay. Whether every retold detail is exact matters less than the atmosphere it preserves. What keeps the boats haunting is that it reveals one of the most disgusting and psychologically corrosive impulses in the history of punishment. The desire not merely to kill a person, but to place that person inside a designed environment of breakdown and make helplessness the central event. History remembers it because it feels less like justice than like a dark experiment in how long terror can be sustained once the victim has been turned into an object of process. In that sense, the boats remains unforgettable, not because it was elegant or symbolic, but because it represents punishment stripped to one of its ugliest ambitions, the complete surrender of the body to a cruelty patient enough to wait. Number 6. The Iron Maiden. Some punishments became terrifying because they were used openly, while others became terrifying because they seemed to condense every fear of hidden torture into one unforgettable shape. The Iron Maiden belongs to that second category of historical dread. Whether it was widely used in the way later imagination claimed, or whether much of its reputation was amplified by myth and museum horror, the image itself became legendary for a reason. A human-sized metal chamber lined with inward-facing spikes represents one of the darkest ideas authority ever attached to punishment. The victim enclosed, immobilized, and brought face-to-face with death inside something built to resemble a container, a coffin, and a machine of pain all at once. That is what gives the Iron Maiden such enduring force. It is not only a device, it is a symbol of punishment becoming architectural. What makes the Iron Maiden so haunting is the claustrophobic intelligence of its design. Many execution methods terrify through openness, through crowds, scaffolds, or prolonged exposure, but this one terrifies through concealment. The body is not merely struck or displayed, it is swallowed. That difference matters because some of history's darkest fears gather around enclosed spaces where the condemned disappears from the world and enters a sealed mechanism controlled entirely by others. Even if later centuries exaggerated the historical reality of the device, the psychological truth of its legend remains powerful. The Iron Maiden feels like the fantasy of absolute domination, a punishment in which the state or the torturer closes the doors and allows the victim's last world to be one of iron, darkness, and engineered inevitability. Its reputation also survives because it sits exactly at the intersection of torture, spectacle, and myth. Unlike methods whose horror lies in administrative routine, the Iron Maiden seems almost too dramatically designed, and that has helped preserve it. History often remembers punishments not only for what they did, but for how perfectly they expressed fear in visual form. The Iron Maiden became one of those forms. It could be displayed, described, imagined, and feared even by people who never needed to see one used. In that sense, it became larger than its probable historical role. It entered cultural memory as a shorthand for the belief that power can build beautiful or elaborate surfaces around inner cruelty, and call that arrangement justice. What keeps the Iron Maiden haunting is that it reveals how punishment can survive through image as much as through record, whether as historical reality, symbolic exaggeration, or a fusion of both. It endures because it captures something people instantly understand: the terror of being enclosed inside a device whose very shape announces that mercy was never part of its design. History remembers it because it made torture look like an object, and objects built for suffering often remain in the imagination longer than the laws that created them. Number 5. Scaphism. Some punishments became terrifying because they used force directly, but others became terrifying because they transformed the condemned into a prisoner of time, exposure, and the body's own helplessness. Scaphism belongs to that darker and more revolting category of historical terror. Often described as an execution method associated with ancient Persia, it survives in memory as one of the most infamous examples of prolonged bodily degradation, a sentence not defined by a single blow or even by one central injury, but by the deliberate orchestration of decay, infestation, and slow death. That is what gives Scaphism such enduring force. It was not simply pain, it was the design of a process. What makes Scaphism so haunting is that it appears to remove the clean boundary between punishment and environment. The victim is not merely acted upon by a blade, a rope, or a wheel. Instead, the body is placed into conditions where nature, exposure, and bodily vulnerability become part of the sentence. That structure is especially disturbing because it makes human cruelty feel patient. Some punishments kill in anger or urgency. Scaphism feels as though it was imagined by people willing to build a condition and then wait for suffering to mature inside it. That is one of the most psychologically corrosive forms of terror in all history, because it suggests power interested not only in death, but in the prolonged observation of breakdown. Its legend has remained powerful partly because it seems almost too horrible to believe. Like several punishments on this list, Scaphism occupies the uneasy border between historical report and the suspicion of exaggeration. But that uncertainty does not weaken its effect. In some ways, it strengthens it. History's most infamous punishments often endure because they reveal not only what may have been done, but what people were willing to imagine authority capable of doing. Scaphism survived because it expresses a fear deeper than legal cruelty alone, the fear that the body can be turned into a site of deliberate decomposition and that those in power may call that transformation deserved. What keeps Scaphism haunting is that it represents punishment at its most degrading and least redeemable. There is almost no symbolic dignity attached to it, no swift finality, no illusion of proportion. It feels like pure abandonment arranged by authority and disguised as sentence. History remembers it because it embodies one of the ugliest truths about torture. Sometimes power does not want only to kill or to extract submission. Sometimes it wants to demonstrate that it can reduce a human being to helpless matter and make that reduction last as long as possible. That is why Scaphism remains one of the darkest punishments ever preserved in memory. Number 4. Impalement. Some punishments became terrifying because they were hidden behind walls, but others became terrifying because they were meant to dominate the landscape itself. Impalement belongs to that darker category of public terror. It survives in historical memory not only as a brutal execution method, but as one of the clearest examples of punishment turned into warning on a scale large enough to scar collective imagination. That is what gives impalement such enduring force. It did not merely kill, it displayed, prolonged, and transformed the victim into part of the visual order of fear. What makes impalement so haunting is the union of suffering and exposure. The method is remembered as both physically agonizing and symbolically overwhelming, because the body was not simply executed and removed. It remained visible. In that visibility, power found one of its cruelest messages. The condemned ceased to be a person in the eyes of authority and became a sign planted into space, a lesson made vertical, impossible to ignore, and difficult to forget. This is one of the reasons impalement survives so strongly in historical memory. It turned punishment into geography. Fields, roads, fortresses, and borders could all become theatres of warning once human bodies were arranged there by command. Its terror was amplified further by the fact that impalement often became associated with rulers or regimes seeking not just justice but domination through dread. In that context, the method takes on an especially dark meaning. It is no longer only an execution, it becomes a political language. By making death conspicuous and prolonged, authority announces that resistance will not simply be ended, but publicly translated into fear for everyone else. That is why impalement appears so often in stories of tyrannical rule and warlord terror. It occupies the point where cruelty and strategy stop being separate. What keeps impalement haunting is that it reveals punishment at its most openly theatrical. There is no pretense of privacy, no effort to soften the sentence into abstraction, no illusion that the body is anything other than material for warning. History remembers it because it made the human form carry the message of power long after the moment of sentencing had ended. In that sense, impalement became more than a method. It became one of the darkest symbols of what rulers do when they want fear itself to become part of the landscape. Number 3. The breaking wheel. Some punishments became terrifying because they killed quickly, but others became terrifying because they transformed the body into a site of slow, structured destruction. The breaking wheel belongs to that second and darker category of terror. It survives in memory as one of the most infamous execution methods in European history, a punishment in which the condemned was bound to or associated with a wheel and subjected to systematic bodily breaking before death arrived or was completed. That is what gives the method such enduring force. It did not rely on a single decisive blow. It relied on sequence. Pain was organized, ruin was staged. What makes the breaking wheel so haunting is the way it combines mechanism with exposure. A wheel is an ordinary object of motion, transport, and labor, but under this punishment it becomes an instrument of bodily undoing. That reversal matters because some of history's most terrifying punishments are not built around exotic invention, but around familiar things turned monstrous by authority. Once the wheel enters the realm of execution, it ceases to represent movement and begins to represent method. The condemned body is no longer moving through the world. It is being methodically reduced in public view, often through a process that was as symbolic as it was agonizing. Its terror also came from the orderliness of its violence. The breaking wheel was not chaos. It was procedure. That is part of what makes it so disturbing. Many people can imagine cruelty as an outburst of rage, but punishments like this reveal a colder truth. Societies often become darkest when they decide to codify suffering, to define how the body should be broken, how long the lesson should last, and what message the spectacle should send to those watching. In the case of the wheel, the punishment was often meant to communicate total defeat. The condemned was not only to die, but to be publicly dismantled as though even bodily integrity had been revoked by law. What keeps the breaking wheel haunting is that it represents one of the clearest ways punishment can become ritualized destruction. History remembers it because it made pain legible, visible, and systematic. The wheel was not just a tool. It was a statement that the sentence would proceed piece by piece until the body itself reflected the total authority of the state. That is why the image remains so strong. A person bound to the machinery of ruin, displayed long enough for the community to understand the lesson, is one of the purest expressions of institutional terror history ever produced. Number 2, Lingchi. Some punishments became terrifying because they were mechanically brutal, but others became terrifying because they seemed to dissolve the boundary between execution and prolonged ritual. Lingchi belongs to that darker category of historical fear, often translated in later English language writing as death by 1,000 cuts, it survives in memory as one of the most infamous execution methods associated with Imperial China, not only because of physical suffering, but because of the symbolic weight attached to the body being reduced piece by piece under the authority of the state. That is what gives Lingchi such enduring force. It was not simply death, it was death unfolded into stages, witnessed, remembered, and transformed into a lesson about total power over the condemned. What makes Lingchi so haunting is the combination of physical agony and social meaning. In many historical punishments, the body is executed and displayed. In Lingchi, the body itself became the process. That difference matters because it changes the emotional structure of the punishment. It no longer feels like a single sentence carried out by force. It feels like authority entering into the body and converting its destruction into a formal spectacle. This is one of the reasons Lingchi remained so feared. The condemned was not merely killed. He was subjected to a procedure meant to demonstrate that punishment could exceed the simple ending of life and become a visible dismantling of personhood itself. Its reputation has also survived because the method became heavily charged in later imagination, especially outside China, where it was often treated as the ultimate image of exoticized cruelty. That means its afterlife in history is not neutral. Lingchi has been interpreted through fear, fascination, propaganda, and misunderstanding. But even with that caution in mind, the terror surrounding it remains real. The method endures because it reveals how execution can be shaped not only by pain, but by the desire to make that pain carry symbolic depth. The state was not merely enforcing death, it was expressing judgment through duration, fragmentation, and public memory. What keeps Lingchi haunting is that it represents punishment at the point where suffering becomes ceremonial. History remembers it because it condensed legal authority, bodily vulnerability, and public warning into one of the most feared images ever attached to execution. It remains powerful not because it is easy to describe, but because it suggests a world in which the sentence did not end when life ended. The sentence extended into the meaning of the body itself, and that is one of the darkest ambitions punishment has ever claimed. Number 1, the brazen bull. Some punishments became terrifying because they were practical, some because they were public, and some because they seemed almost too imaginative in their cruelty to belong to any human legal order at all. The brazen bull stands at number 1 because no other punishment on this list so completely fuses invention, spectacle, symbolism, and nightmare into one enduring image of historical terror. Described as a hollow bronze bull into which the victim was sealed and then roasted alive over fire, the device survives not merely as an execution method, but as a legend of cruelty so concentrated that it feels like power revealing its darkest creativity. That is what gives it unmatched force. It did not simply kill, it transformed death into performance inside a machine built to imitate an animal. What makes the brazen bull so powerful in historical imagination is its design. Many punishments terrify because they expose the body directly, but this one terrifies because it encloses the body inside a crafted object whose very shape turns agony into theatre. The condemned disappears into metal. Fire is applied from below. Sound is altered. The victim becomes trapped inside an image, and that image is not neutral. It is monumental, deliberate, and almost ceremonial in its cruelty. This is one of the darkest things history ever imagined about punishment. Not only that people could be killed painfully, but that artifice itself could be enlisted to make the punishment more total, more symbolic, and more unforgettable. Its legendary status is strengthened by the possibility that retelling, exaggeration, and moral horror helped magnify its place in memory. But that does not weaken its power. In some ways, it strengthens it. The most infamous punishments often survive not because they were statistically common, but because they express something so pure about the imagination of tyranny that history cannot stop repeating them. The brazen bull became one of those images. It stands for the ruler or state that no longer seeks merely to punish a body, but to demonstrate that ingenuity itself can be put in the service of suffering. Once punishment acquires that quality, it stops feeling like law and begins to feel like the aesthetic of domination. What makes the brazen bull worthy of the #1 place is that it represents the most terrifying possibility in all historical punishment, that cruelty can become creative. It turned suffering into a sealed spectacle, converted metal into terror, and preserved in memory the idea that power sometimes wants more than obedience, confession, or death. Sometimes it wants to prove that its imagination is darker than the victim's hope. That is why the brazen bull remains unforgettable. It is not only a method of execution, it is the nightmare of punishment shaped into an object.